And amid these geopolitical conflicts and uncertainties, how are things shaping up for the Philippine and regional economies? Joining us now in the studio is International Monetary Fund Resident Representative Ragnar Gudmundsson. Ragnar, thank you so much for joining us on The Final Word. How concerned are you that this ongoing conflict in the Middle East will have an impact on the Philippines and the region?
I think there may be two main channels through which this conflict could have an impact on the Philippines and in the region. One channel is through energy prices. If the conflict endures, or if it were to escalate to the region, it could have severe consequences for energy prices. And the Philippines, being an oil importer, this could kind of further complicate efforts to reduce inflation. So that would be one main channel. Another channel, of course, is remittances. We know that the Philippines is very strongly reliant on remittances from foreign workers in the region. And of course, if those remittances were to decline, this could have an impact on the balance of payments, on the current account, and also even, I think, on providing support to households here in the Philippines. We know how important remittances are for the Philippines in order to provide supports to household and fuel consumption. So these are concerns that we have.
All right, basically it's two-pronged. One is inflation and remittances. Let's take a look at inflation. It's been rearing again its ugly head over the past couple of months. So with this Israel-Hamas conflict, are we likely to see inflation in the Philippines continuing to rise rather than decrease to between the 2 to 4% inflation level that the government wants to attain before year's end?
I think it's still very early to tell what the medium-term, long-term consequences of the conflict will be. What we do know right now is that inflation has been trending down recently. This was the case, until this summer. And then we saw headline inflation start to pick up again because of the increase in food and energy prices.
And rice inflation is at a 14-year high at 17%, levels we haven't seen since 2008.
I think that for rice inflation, we should see some positive news linked to the harvest here in the Philippines and the arrival of imports into the country, which should help stabilize rice prices. But of course, energy prices are still an unknown. What we do think is that the monetary policy here in the Philippines has contributed to anchor inflation expectations and to bring inflation back down to the target range we project by the first quarter of 2024. It's still very early to tell what will be the exact impact of this new crisis, and it's something that it's not just the Philippines. It's all countries need to be prepared for a potential impact on higher oil prices.
So to prevent a further increase in inflation, which could materialize in the next data, are we likely to see, because Eli Remolona, who is the Bangko Sentral governor, says that there could potentially be another rate increase. So would you advise them to increase interest rates before we see an increase?
I think, even before this crisis, our advice was, for the authorities here in the Philippines to continue having a tightening monetary stance until the inflation rates fall back firmly within the government's target range of 2 to 4%. So that policy recommendation was in place already before this crisis. I think that policy recommendation is simply, becomes even more relevant right now.
And what is the outlook of the International Monetary Fund for Philippine inflation in the final quarter and for the full year of 2023?
Well, we have seen headline inflation pick up a little bit in September, but we have seen core inflation coming down. Core inflation is inflation excluding food and energy prices, which is what you really want to come down. So our projection for the year as a whole is still for inflation to reach 6% for the year as a whole and to come back to the upper end of the target range by early 2024.
So it's impossible for the government target of 2 to 4%. That's out of the question.
For 2023, that that will not happen. However, for 2024, that is still possible.
What about remittances? They are the backbone of the Philippine economy, over $30 billion a year. If we see this conflict of Israel and Hamas expanding to a regional conflict, there are a lot of Filipino OFWs in the Middle East. How much of an impact could this have on economic growth in the country?
Well, to the extent that remittances represent about 7 to 8% of GDP, this could have an important impact on consumption and demand in the Philippines. And so we are still projecting GDP growth to pick up in 2024 and to reach 6%. This is something that we will have to continue monitoring closely, because if anything, what we see is that I think we still, our baseline projection for 2024 is still 6%, but this is a new potential downside risks to that growth outlook. So it's simply something that we will have to continue monitoring, and I think the outcome will really kind of depend on the evolution of the political dynamics in the region.
But of course, let's take a look at 2023, Ragnar, and the government's target is 6 to 7%. And the government says we can still attain that economic growth. But to be able to attain that growth, you need at least 6.6% on average growth expansion in the second half of the year. So what is the IMF's projection?
So for 2023, as you rightly point out, meeting a 6 to 7% target,
it's not possible.
It would be extremely difficult. And so our projection for 2023 is growth of 5.3%. We think that growth has kind of bottomed out in the second quarter of 2023, but it's already showing signs of picking up in the second half of this year, and that pickup in growth would continue in 2024. That's the baseline. But as I did mention, there are downside risks to those projections. There are also a few upside risks, especially if we do see that in the global economy, if we do witness a soft landing with disinflation really taking hold. But that is subject to ongoing developments.
But given the Philippine economic fundamentals, Ragnar, what are the positives? How can we insulate ourselves from the negative developments externally?
Okay, so I think first of all, macroeconomic fundamentals in the Philippines are sound. The fiscal position is sound. The central bank has been taking the right measures in order to control inflation. Debt levels remain manageable. So the overall macroeconomic environment is still solid in the Philippines. And that means that if indeed, if the downside risks materialize, there is still room for the government to stimulate the economy. So I think that's one clear positive, and maybe one of the reasons why the Philippines is indeed different from many other emerging market economies who don't have the same rooms for maneuver. So that's one big positive. I think also what works in the favor of the Philippines is that the demand for services has been increasing. Even though we see that at the global level, the demand for goods imports, goods exports has been coming down, the demand for services is strong. And that's one of the areas where the Philippines is indeed a country which has a comparative advantage. So the service sector in the Philippines is still strong. That's another positive. Another positive is also maybe the interests we have seen from foreign investors over the last year. The government, the administration has been going on roadshows. Diplomatic relations with some important partners have really strengthened in the last year. And what I hear from the chambers of commerce in the Philippines, whether it's the European Chamber of Commerce or the American Chamber of Commerce or even the Japanese Chamber of Commerce, there is strong interest to invest in the Philippines, interest to invest in telecoms, in the energy transition. These are potential growth areas for the Philippines.
Amid the developments locally and internationally, there are positives and negatives in the economic fundamentals. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
For joining us on The Final Word, Ragnar Gudmundsson, Resident Representative for the International Monetary Fund.
Thank you for having me.